And Jesus said to them, I myself am the bread of life. The man who comes to me will never be hungry, and the man who believes in me will never again be thirsty. At this, the Jews began to grumble, because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven, remarking, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose parents we know? How can he say that I have come down from heaven? So Jesus answered them, do not grumble among yourselves. Nobody comes to me unless he is drawn to me by the Father who sent me. And I will raise him up when the last day comes. In the prophets it is written, and they shall all be taught by God. And this means that everybody who has heard the Father's voice and learned from him, will come to me. Not that anyone has ever seen the Father, except the one who comes from God. He has seen the Father. I assure you that the man who trusts in him has eternal life already. I myself am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate manna in the desert and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, bread which came down from heaven, and if anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. The bread which I give is my body, and I will give it for all life, for the life of the world.
Thank you, Frank, for reading. Those of you who may have a memory of last week may feel like, oh, we read that passage last week, but it's an extension. It is like part B from the part we read last week, and some of the themes continue from last week to this week. In the 18th century, Great Awakening, I'm sure if you were like me, you learned about this in, I don't know, junior high or someplace. The Great Awakening in the 18th century, Howell Harris of Wales preached to his countrymen. He just went around to his own countrymen and preached, and hundreds and sometimes thousands of people would show up. And many, many, many of them chose to become Christians in that moment of hearing him preach and responding to the Jesus that they heard about. William Williams, one of the converts for Howell Harris, altered his life's direction. So profoundly was he moved that he began to understand a new direction for his life. It's a transformational moment that happened to him. I don't know if that's happened to you at any time in your life where you're sort of going down the path that you think you should go down, and something steps in front of you, and something changes the direction that you had chosen, and you're ready to go a new direction. William Williams altered his life direction because of hearing Howell Harris preach. He had just graduated from med school. He was preparing his life for a life of service in medicine, to serve as a physician, but he was transformed, and rather than doing that, he changed the direction completely and began to continue to hang out with Howell Harris, and he began to learn to preach, and he learned the gospel story. And we don't remember Williams much in our historical rendering of the Great Awakening, not for his preaching, although he was very effective. He too preached to hundreds and thousands of people. Rather, we remember him because of his religious poetry. He began to write about the faith and the messages that he had and began to structure them in a poetic form or fashion. And then music was put to those poems, and they became well-known hymns. We sang one this morning, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. In all, there some 800 or so William Williams hymns, poetry put to music. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. What a magnificent hymn that is. It was sung at the funeral of Princess Grace a few years ago. President Garfield, after being shot, rallied for a few hours and sat up, and his wife began to sing this hymn to him softly as he was in fact dying. He rallied for a bit and then he died. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. Pilgrim through this barren land, I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. That's an amazing line of poetry. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. It's a powerful prayer coming from one who recognizes that he or she has come to the end of their sustenance. I was asking the early service crowd whether they recalled the last time they felt hungry. I'm not talking about hungry like I had a big breakfast this morning and it's 4 o'clock, that kind of hungry. I'm talking about true hunger where we begin to waste away, where we really begin to suffer, and the body itself comes to a place where it asks for more. Hunger can be of a physical nature, but the real power in this is that which might come as the hunger of the soul, in which we come to the place where we recognize that our soul is famishing and we don't have everything that we need. Jesus said he was the bread from heaven. And the ears of his countrymen perked up as he said that, because he was tapping into a deep memory that this would be a sign. The manna, the experience of daily bread, was a sign of the providence of God. It was a sign of the appearance of when the Messiah might come. And they began to be really excited when he talked about the manna. That's an ancient story. It's an ancient memory. Likely you have been like me, that one of the millions who either read the book or saw the PBS series on Bruce Feiler's book, Walking the Bible. It's been about 15 years or so. It's so wonderful because it puts images, it puts film together in a way that we can see the land of the Bible. And he actually walks from place to place in Israel and in the Holy Land, the various countries around there. Feiler is a writer who's given us this terrific series of books, there's more than one, that feature history and geography of this ancient land of the Hebrew Scriptures. And he paints a vivid picture of the problems the children of Israel encountered after they crossed the Red Sea to escape slavery. Join me in that memory and realize that the word had come within hours that they would be packing up and they would follow Moses. And where did he go? He went to the edge of the sea. Now what? And then the miracle of their escape from Egypt occurred, and they found themselves on the far shore. You realize what they had and what they didn't have. They didn't have much. They didn't have time to pack it up. Lots of their possessions they left behind in the slave camp in Egypt. They didn't have food. They didn't have water. They didn't have much of a direction. I mean, these are three pretty important points of the journey that they were about to take. No food, no water, no direction. Feiler writes about this. Once the Israelites arrive in the desert, they realize their dire condition. Once they get on the other shore, they begin to understand we have great needs. No food, no water, no idea where they're headed. They really didn't have much of an idea. Moses may have had some kind of an idea, but he's up front and they're back here in the back. And immediately they go to their one response that they give on this whole journey, 40 years of journeying together. They complain. They come to the place, this is like those of you who've gone on like a youth mission trip, where you're with a gaggle of teenagers and you're doing some very serious, difficult things. It doesn't take long for the good times to open up into complaining. When are we going to stop and eat? I'm thirsty. I need to go to the bathroom. Can we stop? This is the way the trip was, a cycle that's repeated for 40 years. The people protest. Moses becomes exasperated. Those two are the same thing. He is just filled with exasperation from them. God intervenes, and that's what this story is based upon. That Hebrew story, that wonderful Hebrew story, gets reenacted in this moment with Jesus and his disciples. And the people are temporarily placated. Before, it doesn't take long, they start complaining again. It's one cycle after another, it never breaks. And in each case, the people receive God's blessing and continue their trek. That's the way the trip happens. Manna, depending on how you wish to say it. This is the mystery meal. We read about this culinary delight from out in the desert. We ask the same thing that the Israelites asked. What is it? It's manna, which means literally in their language, what is it? This is the question that they have. The food that fell on the ground in the morning and fed the children of God is also mentioned in 9 books out of the Bible. This is a story that has staying power. It's the most visible sign in these 40 years of wandering in the desert of the daily care and attention given to them in the desert. Many of you are readers, and maybe you've read Abraham Maslow and studied Maslow in his ideas about the nature of man, and he had a thing called the hierarchy of needs, and it's a pyramid of sorts, and the lowest level are the most basic elements of things that we need: food and water and safety and security. And as each level is laid, it becomes more and more really sophisticated until finally at the end, at the top, there's a sense of self-fulfillment. This is basic Abraham Maslow, Psych 101 maybe. And he raises an interesting question with this hierarchy of needs, which is this down at the very bottom where food and water and direction or safety or security is there. He wants to know whether life itself is in jeopardy. That would be a question that Maslow would have about this story. What is it, they ask, and the question still hangs out there not fully answered. And it creates a dilemma because so many people think that if we can just take on the needs of the higher part of the pyramid, but ignore the very basics, that something magical will happen. And so today in our culture is the idea of hanging the 10 Commandments in classrooms and schools. I don't see it here, do you? That's a great irony, and most churches do not even put this up. But if the children are hungry, what good does that do? That's the nature of this problem of daily bread. Early rabbis, they had a whole school of thought about the manna, and they suggested that whoever ate the manna had the strength of angels. So you get this picture from the rabbis of sort of this wonderful sense of fulfillment that's there. They claimed that manna was so pure and nutritious and so easily absorbed by the body that you didn't even need a bowel movement. Thank you, rabbis, for helping us understand that. They had such an exalted view. They taught also that manna had the capability of becoming whatever it is that you imagined it to be. Do you like burnt ends and beans? Your manna would take on the flavor of those things, the rabbis would say. No sooner had one thought of it than the manna had the flavor of the dish he or she desired. Now, this is rabbinical teaching, and it's meant to make a point. It may not be meant to teach science. Remember that the Israelites were told to gather only that which would be eaten on that particular day. They were told not to save any. Don't get more than you need. Get what you need for today, and that's it, with the exception of the Sabbath, Shabbat. And the day before, you gather twice as much. This is what the rabbis would teach about manna. It was to be eaten on that day, but eaten fresh. So the Sabbath rules, according to the rabbis, the manna gathered on the previous day, quote, sparkled more than usual. Again, this is rabbinical teaching to assure the people of Israel of just how good they had it. So much for the taste and the good reviews it got from the restaurant critics of its day. Its taste only added to the intrigue of this question that continued to hang out. What is it? And what do you think this means? It has meaning, and that's maybe what we should get to, and let me quit doing the 100 questions out of this text. What do you think it means? Well, Jesus draws from the richness of it all, and he boldly tells them, I am the bread. This is a part of a series of I am comments that Jesus makes, captured in the Gospel of John. I am. Ego, eimi. Ego, I am. And Jesus goes about in the Gospel of John telling people who he is. I am the bread that came down from heaven. He also said, whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I don't know what you do with all of that, but there's something where Jesus is giving us a proposition about himself and our relationship with God. And so the people look at him and they scratch their heads, and then they say to one another, who is this guy to take Moses' story and make it his own? And Jesus hears that, and he says to them, stop complaining. See, they're living in that ancient story out in the desert of the complaining and the questions and the Jewish series of questions. And finally, he had to come to the point to say to them, stop complaining. Just let these things be. This well-known story of the complaining Israelites in the desert under the leadership of Moses was being unconsciously transferred to Jesus. They found themselves in that ancient story, in the memory of it. They found themselves in that time, and Jesus in that time, but they were all embedded in this story. And Jesus was the recipient of their unconscious projection, and they were blinded to the bread that was right in front of them. Not the bread as we might put on a plate at the table, but the bread of Jesus being in front of them. And they missed it. They couldn't see it. Jesus, the bread of heaven, had fallen into the center of their needy ways of life. He just walked into the middle of them, and they found themselves back in that old story. And he found himself asserting to them, I am the bread. Instead of cracking open a rock and water flowing out of it, Jesus offered them water that would quench their soul's great thirst. Instead of offering them bread that would go stale after only a day or two, he offered them his own body as bread from heaven that would fill them with his very presence from the rigors of life. And all they seem to be able to muster is this question, who is this guy? So the story goes on. Amen.